The famous Star of Bethlehem may not have been a star at all, but an extremely rare planetary alignment per a University of Notre Dame astrophysicist Grant Matthews. Astronomers, historians, and theologians have pondered the question of the Christmas star for many years, said Matthews in a press release. Where and when did it appear? What did it look like? Of the billions of stars out there, which among them shone bright on that day so long ago? After studying historical, astronomical, and biblical records, Matthews believes that the event that led the Magi to Bethlehem was a rare planetary alignment that occurred in 6 BC. During the alignment, the Sun, Jupiter, the Moon, and Saturn were all in Aries, while Venus was next door in Pisces and Mercury and Mars were on the other side in Taurus. At the time, Aries was also the location of the vernal equinox. Matthews' research notes that the presence of Jupiter and the Moon signified the birth of a ruler with a special destiny. Saturn was a symbol of the giving of life, as was the presence of Aries in the vernal equinox, also marking the start of spring. The professor said that alignment in Aries signified a newborn ruler in Judea, to the Magi, which were the Zoroastrian priests from ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia. What if another celestial body, a massive planetary object on a larger elliptical orbit, joined in on this event? A planet recorded on Sumerian cuneiform tablets over 5,000 years ago that described the home of the Anunnaki, a planet named Nibiru. Long before the field of astrophysics posited that the Star of Bethlehem may have been a different type of event, well-known ancient astronaut theorist Lloyd Pye offered an alternate explanation. In referencing the timeline of the planet Nibiru, Pye said the following: "I base my theory, my belief in it, around the end of the last ice age and the Great Flood. If you divide 3600, working your way down, you get the last time Nibiru was here around 200 BC. But if you waffle that a couple of hundred years to around zero, because it's not necessarily exactly like clockwork, 3600 years, that could be just an approximation. So if you bring it to around the year zero, then I think you could explain the Star of Bethlehem, which is reasonably well documented in that it was a star. Now, what was it? There are various theories about it being conjunctions of planets in the sky, but if you make the assumption that something was there for sure to be written about in the way that it was, I would think that Nibiru would be a good candidate for being the Star of Bethlehem, the unexplained, the unexpected star in the sky." If the viewer is not familiar with Lloyd Pye, the archive highly recommends taking a look at 2 of his works, Everything You Know Is Wrong and Intervention Theory. Considering that the celestial event known as the Star of Bethlehem may have in fact been the latest appearance of the planet Nibiru, a larger question now presents itself. What is the relevance of Jesus' birth to Nibiru and the Anunnaki? This provocative question requires a lengthy and meticulous answer, and one has been provided by Sir Lawrence Gardner. Apart from Zechariah Sitchin, Gardner was perhaps the most knowledgeable researcher on the topic of the Messianic bloodline and its relation to the Anunnaki. The archive is soon releasing a production based on Gardner's research found in his work, Genesis of the Grail Kings. The full answer to the question of Jesus' relation to the history of the Anunnaki on Earth is provided in this work. Additionally, the topic is also covered in his book, Bloodline of the Holy Grail, and the archive has already posted a 4-part series covering that research. Links are listed in the description below this video. In an effort to make this presentation somewhat brief, the archive is providing a limited number of Gardner's excerpts which succinctly highlight the Anunnaki relationship to Jesus. Clearly, I had to get back to the more ancient writings in order to find any anomalies. Given that the first group of these books was written while the Jews were held captive in Mesopotamian Babylon in the 6th century BC, it is apparent that Babylon was where the original records were then held. In fact, from the time of Adam through some 19 said generations down to Abraham, the whole of Old Testament patriarchal history was Mesopotamian. More specifically, the history was from Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, where the ancient Sumerians did indeed refer to the grasslands of the Euphrates Delta as the Eden. The old writings tell us that throughout the patriarchal era, the Israelites endeavored to support Adon, the Lord, but at every turn El Shaddai, the storm god, Jehovah, retaliated with floods, tempests, famines, and destruction. It leaves us knowing that within an overall pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom are actually named in the Bible, there were two predominant and opposing gods, known as El Elyon and Baal, El Shaddai and Adon, Ahriman and Mazda, Jehovah and Lord, God and Father. But these styles are all titular, they are not personal names. So who precisely were they? To find the answer, we have to look no further than where these gods were actually operative. And the old Canaanite text, discovered in Syria in the 1920s, tells us that their courts were in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in Mesopotamia in the Sumerian Eden Delta of the Persian Gulf. But what did the ancient Sumerians call these two gods? What were their personal names? We can trace the Sumerian written records back to about 3700 BC, and they tell us that the gods in question were brothers. In Sumer, the storm god who eventually became known as Jehovah was called Enlil, meaning ruler of the mountain, and his brother who became Adon, the Lord, was called Enki. This name is really important to our story because Enki means archetype. The texts inform us that it was Enlil who brought the flood. It was Enlil who destroyed Ur and Babylon, and it was Enlil who constantly opposed the education and enlightenment of humankind. Indeed, the early Syrian texts tell us that it was Enlil who obliterated the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah on the Dead Sea, not because they were dens of wickedness, as we are taught, but because they were great centers of wisdom and learning. It was Enki, on the other hand, who, despite the wrath of his brother, granted the Sumerians access to the Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life. It was Enki who set up the escape strategy during the flood, and it was Enki who passed over the time-honored Tablets of Destiny, the tablets of scientific law which became the bedrock of the early mystery schools in Egypt. But what were the earliest aims and ambitions of the order back in pharaonic times? They were to perpetuate and advance the alchemical strength of the royal bloodline from Lord Enki, the archetype. The kings of the early succession, who reigned in Sumer and Egypt before becoming kings of Israel, were anointed upon coronation with the fat of the dragon, or the sacred crocodile. This noble beast was referred to in Egypt as the Messiah, from which derived the Hebrew verb to anoint, and the kings of this dynastic succession were always referred to as dragons or messiahs, meaning anointed ones. In the times of battle, when the armies of different kingdoms were conjoined, the overall leader was chosen, and he was called the Great Dragon, or the King of Kings, or as we better know the name in its old Celtic form, the Pendragon. One of the interesting items from the archives of the Dragon Court is the origin of the word kingship. It derives from the very earliest of Sumerian culture, wherein kingship was identical with kinship, and kin means blood relative. In its original form, kinship was Cainship, and the first king of the Messianic dragon succession was the biblical Cain, head of the Sumerian house of Kish. On recognizing this, one can immediately see the first anomaly in the traditional Genesis story, for the historical line to David and Jesus was not from Adam and Eve's son Seth at all. It was from Eve's son Cain, who recorded successors, although given little space in the Old Testament, were the first great kings of Mesopotamia and Egypt. We all tend to think of Cain as being the first son of Adam and Eve, but he was not. Even the book of Genesis tells us that he was not, and it confirms how Eve told Adam that Cain's father was the Lord. Who was the Lord? The Lord was Adon, and Adon was Enki. Even outside the Bible, the writings of the Hebrew Talmud and Midrash make it quite plain that Cain was not the son of Adam. So what else have we been wrongly taught about this particular aspect of history? The book of Genesis, in its English translated form, tells us that Cain was a tiller of the ground. But this is not what the original texts say at all. What they say is that Cain had dominion over the earth, which is a rather different matter when considering his kingly status. There's a lot to be said about the story of Adam and Eve and of how they were the result of clinical cloning. Writers such as Zecharia Sitchin have written at some length in this regard, and my new book delves far more deeply into the subject. I shall not dwell upon this particular aspect now because I want to move more directly into the alchemy of the messianic bloodline of the earthly dragon kings. What I will say is that the Sumerian records state that Adam and Eve, known then as Ataba and Ava and jointly as Adama, were purpose-bred for kingship at the house of Shemti by Enki and his sister wife Ninhursag. In Sumerian, the word Shemti meant breath, wind, life. Ninhursag was called Lady of the Embryo or Lady of Life, and she was the surrogate mother for Ataba and Ava, who were created from human ova fertilized by the Lord Enki. It was because of Ninhursag's title, Lady of Life, that Ava was later given the same title by the Hebrews. Indeed, the name Ava, or Eve, was subsequently said to mean life. And there is an interesting parallel here because in Sumerian, the distinction Lady of Life, or Ninti, Nin meaning lady and Ti meaning life. However, another Sumerian word, Ti, with the longer pronunciation T, meant rib, and it was by virtue of the Hebrews' misunderstanding of the two words, Ti and T, that Eve also became incorrectly associated with Adam's rib. Both Enki and Ninhursag, along with their brother Enlil, the later Jehovah, belonged to a pantheon of gods and goddesses referred to as the Anunnaki, meaning heaven came to earth. In fact, the grand assembly of the Anunnaki, later called the court of the Elohim, is mentioned in Psalm 82, wherein Jehovah makes his bid for supreme power over the other gods. According to the dragon tradition, the importance of Cain was that he was directly produced by Enki and Ava, so his blood was 3/4 Anunnaki. His half-brothers, Hevel and Satanel, better known as Abel and Seth, were less than half Anunnaki, being the offspring of Taba and Ava, Adam and Eve. In order to further enhance the succession from Cain, he was married to his half-sister, a purebred Anunnaki princess, Luluwa. Her father was Enki and her mother was Lilith, a granddaughter of Enlil. Although not giving the name of Cain's wife, the Bible does name their younger son Enoch, while the Sumerian records cite his elder son and kingly successor, Aten, who is perhaps better known as King Etana of Kish. Etana was said to have walked with the gods, and to have been fed from the plant of birth, or the tree of life as it's called in Genesis. Henceforth, the kings of the line were designated as being the twigs of the tree, and the ancient word for twig was clone. In later times, this plant or tree was redefined as a vine, and so the Grail, the vine, and the Messianic bloodline became conjoined as one in the literature of subsequent ages. While the archive does not agree with the timeline of the Star of Bethlehem being the planet Nibiru, it does see an opening that Pi recognized based on the Ice Age timeline. So as we move down the rabbit hole, if we look at the year 0 and realize that the Anunnaki are on a 36-1 in our perception of time, then we see the year 556 BCE was merely about 7 weeks away from the Star of Bethlehem event in Anunnaki time. And if you want to calculate the possibilities of elliptical orbits, you can slow it down and you can speed it up, but at the end you will find at least one outcome that says the Anunnaki could have had a celestial relevance to this event. Basically, in the end, it is well within the possibility that Jesus was connected to the most recent Nibiru pass. We have all learned to go along with what we're taught about the Gospels in schoolrooms and churches. But is the teaching correctly related? Does it always conform with the written scriptures? It is actually quite surprising how much we learn from pulpits or picture books without checking the biblical text. The Nativity story itself provides a good example. It is widely accepted, as the Christmas card keeps reminding us, that Jesus was born in a stable, but the Gospels do not say that. In fact, there is no stable mentioned in any authorized Gospel. The Nativity is not mentioned at all in Mark or John, and Matthew makes it quite plain that Jesus was born in a house. So where did the stable idea come from? It came from a misinterpretation of the Gospel of Luke, which relates that Jesus was laid in a manger. Not born, as often misquoted, but laid, and a manger was and still is nothing more than an animal feeding box. In practice, it was perfectly common for mangers to be used as emergency cradles, and they were often brought indoors for that very purpose. So why has it been presumed that this particular manger was in a stable? Because the English translations of Luke tell us that there was no room in the inn. But the old manuscript of Luke did not say that. In fact, there were no inns in the region. Travelers lodged in private houses, and family hospitality was a normal way of life in those days. In fact, if we are really going to be precise, there were no stables in the region either. Stable is an English word that specifically defines a place for keeping horses. But few horses, apart from some Roman officers, were ever used in first century Judea. They mainly used mules and oxen, which, if kept under a cover at all, would have been in some type of outhouse and certainly not a stable. As for the mythical inn, the original Greek text of Luke does not relate that there was no room in the inn. By the best translation, it actually states that there was no provision in the room. As previously mentioned, Matthew states that Jesus was born in a house. When correctly translated, Luke reveals that Jesus was laid in a manger because there was no cradle provided in the room. While on the subject of Jesus' birth, we ought to look at the chronology here, because the two Gospels which deal with the Nativity actually give different dates for the event. According to Matthew, Jesus was born in the reign of Herod the Great, who debated the event with the Magi and apparently ordered the slaying of the infants. King Herod died in the notional year 4 BC, so we know from Matthew that Jesus was born before that. Indeed, because of this, most standard concordance Bibles give 5 BC as Jesus' date of birth. In Luke, however, a completely different date is given. This gospel states that Jesus was born while Cyrenius was governor of Syria, the same year that Emperor Augustus implemented the national taxing census, which caused Joseph and Mary to go to Bethlehem. There are two relevant points to mention here, both of which are recorded in the first century Jewish annals. Cyrenius was not appointed governor of Syria until 6 AD, and this was the very year that Emperor Augustus implemented the census, which was supervised by Cyrenius himself. So Jesus appears to have been born on two separate occasions, before 4 BC and again in 6 AD. Is there a mistake in one of the Gospels? Not necessarily, at least not in the way things were originally portrayed. We are actually looking at two quite specific births, Jesus' physical birth and his community birth. These were defined as the first and second births. The second being an initiation into society by way of a ritual ceremony of rebirth. Second births for boys took place at the age of 12, a ceremony in which they were ritualistically born again from their mother's womb. And so we now know from Luke that Jesus was 12 in 6 AD, Unfortunately, the Latter-day Gospel translators and transcribers completely missed the significance of this, while subsequent church teachings combined the Matthew and Luke accounts into one, giving rise to the spurious nonsense about a nativity scene in a stable. Since Jesus was 12 in 6 AD, as given in Luke, then he was actually born in 7 BC, which was indeed during the late reign of Herod the Great, as related in Matthew. But we now discover what appears to be another anomaly. The Luke Gospel then says that when Jesus was 12 years old, his parents, Mary and Joseph, took him to Jerusalem for the day, only to walk homewards for a full day's journey with their friends before they realized that Jesus was not in their party. Then they returned to Jerusalem to find him at the temple discussing his father's business with the doctors. In reality, what sort of parents would wander for a whole day in the desert without knowing their 12-year-old son was not with them? The fact is that the whole point of the passage has been lost in the translation, for there was a wealth of difference between a 12-year-old son and a son in his 12th year. When a son, on completing his initial 12 years, that is to say on reaching his 13th birthday, was initiated into the community at the ceremony of the second birth, he was regarded as commencing his first year. It was the original root of the modern bar mitzvah. His next initiation, the initiation of manhood in the community, took place in his 9th year, when he was 21, the root of the age 21 privilege. Various degrees then followed, and the next major test was at the end of his 12th year, at the age of 24. It is therefore apparent that when Jesus remained at the temple in the 12th year, he was actually 24 years old, not 12. And for his discussion with the doctors, this would have related to his next degree, the degree set by his spiritual father, whose business he discussed. At that time, his spiritual father, the overall patriarch, was Simeon of the Essene. And we see in Luke that it was precisely this man, the just and devout Simeon, who had legitimated Jesus under the law. So, can we trust the Gospels? The answer to the question is yes, we can trust them to a point, but we cannot trust the convoluted and distorted versions which are published and presented to us today.